Good afternoon, everyone. It is 12:01, and I would love to honor everyone's time. So I will begin by saying good afternoon, Rochester community members. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Equity Alliance Equity Series. This is the second episode of 2025. And just as a reminder, it is Black History Month, and there are lots of different activities across the city in different organizations. So please join those as you can. And if you have any additional ones that you want to put in the chat that folks might not know about, please feel free to share those. Today, we are going to have a little bit of an unconventional episode because I'm joined by my partner, Wafa El Khalifa, who is the Equitable Development Coordinator for Destination Medical Center. And we will be having a conversation around safe spaces at work, creating a culture of inclusion and belonging in the workplace. And this conversation is really centered on all of the conversations and questions that we have heard from community members in the last couple of weeks. Folks have a lot of questions about how do I continue to curate and create spaces within my own organization that are safe for the people that are working there. And so we only have about an hour, and so it'll be a fairly generic conversation. We maybe will spend a little more time on this as the year goes through. But I will begin by providing a little bit of background on workplace safety in this case, as I'm referring to it. And then Wafa will take the second portion with some ideas that you might want to implement within your own organization. As usual, feel free to utilize the chat if you have any questions or reflections or thoughts. Wafa will be monitoring that, and we'll do our best to answer any questions that we might have. If we don't get to any of your questions or some of the questions you have, then we will be sure to get that information back to you via email. So in this case, we're very accustomed to talking about workplace safety in terms of physical safety, and there's a lot of training around that is mandated. But for our conversation today, we're actually thinking about workplace safety very much from a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. So workplace safety that goes beyond just physical safety. We're thinking about safety that includes psychological safety, equitable access to resources, and an inclusive environment. We're thinking about addressing bias and harassment, having inclusive policy development, mental health and well-being of folks within your own organizations. And we want to be cognizant of the fact that we might be coming to this conversation from very different places as we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So also being thoughtful about what the definition is for our specific conversation. And so I want to begin by having a little bit of interaction. So if you happen to have a device, like a smartphone in front of you, or you could do this on your computer, please go to slido.com and enter that number or use the QR code. And here's the question of the day for all of you to respond to. What is one word that comes to mind when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
And Chow, I think we're good on time. I would say keep this screen on for a little bit because people are still joining us.
Oh,
Well,
certainly.
admitting people, which is great. So maybe repeat a little bit of what they should be doing here.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're centering our conversation on workplace safety from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective. So curious to hear from everyone, as you think about this, what is one word that comes to mind when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I'm glad to see all the responses that are coming through here. I see necessary, belonging, humanity, welcoming, precious, important, all-encompassing, connection. I'm repeating for those that might not be able to see the screen. Access, progress, okay, acceptance, identity, and connection. Any other responses that folks might have? I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to respond to this. welcoming is very popular here.
I think some folks are adding them on the chat.
Oh, thank you. And Wafa, if you're able to then add them to the slider from the chat so that they can show up on our screen here, I would
Maybe,
appreciate it.
maybe. I'll try my best.
You'll try. Thank you for your participation in this. And part of why we ask this question is a lot of times we're having a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I recognize that we're sometimes coming from very different places when we're having this conversation. But it is good to see that we are, for the most part, on the same page, that we're thinking about welcoming spaces, we're thinking about places of belonging, we're thinking about it as necessary and respectful or the way to go forward in our own organizations. And so I would like to delve a little bit into, and I will go to the next slide, Wafa, if that's okay. I think there's one more person typing, so I'll give them a moment here. Togetherness, right? So thank you for that. As we reflect on this word, I think it would be good to be able to see who our community is. And so, who is Rochester, Minnesota, as we're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion as a whole? I share this information all the time. We pull it from the census from Minnesota Compass. And want to center this voices, which are our community voices. The idea that for a community of our size, which is about 120 something thousand people, we have a fairly large number of people who are foreign born, which provides us about 18% of folks in our community that are multilingual. So thinking about that variety of culture. We also know that we have a large number of our residents who identify as white and a growing number of population that identify as BIPOC or communities of color. We're thinking about our residents that have a disability, and that is varied. It might be a physical disability, might be a different one. We only collect information by gender in terms of male and female according to the census, so this is what we have. But we're also thinking about socioeconomics. About 9% of our residents who are below poverty by federal guidelines, knowing that if we were to look at this particular item in terms of income by race, as an example, that would be very different, right? And then housing, which comes up all the time. The percent of our community members who are renters who are cost burdened, which means they're paying a third or more of their income towards rent, and the 15% who own their homes who are paying a third or more towards their mortgage. So when we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in our conversations, Ofai and I are talking about the broad spectrum of human identity across our city and in your organizations. These are the folks that we serve on a daily basis. These are also the folks who work in our organizations, right? So, with this framework in mind, and asking for really honest feedback to this follow up questions, with that in mind, do you think that the employees in your organization feel safe at work? And again, if you want to scan the QR code and answer this question, or go to Slido and enter that number to respond to this question. Do you think that employees in your organization feel safe as we're looking at that broad spectrum of human identity that we just referenced?
And folks who can't use Slido and you want to answer this question, you can send me a direct message and I'll try my best to include it on the Slido.
I appreciate the participation here. And it is okay to answer this question based on employees in your organization. And if you are not part of an organization, you could answer that as a community member as well. Okay. I believe we have the participation of just about everyone on the call.
I'm adding one more.
Okay. Okay. So I see a large number of folks who say yes, others that say sometimes, a couple that say no. Okay. One more question before we delve into our conversation here. Wafa, is it okay for me to proceed? Okay. Do you feel that employees in your organization can show up authentically? Can they show up as themselves, regardless of who they are, where they're from, what language they speak, how they worship, etc.? Okay. Varied responses. A lot of you say most of the time. A little bit of a tie on yes, always, and sometimes, and just a few that say no, never. I do see a couple more entries here. Okay. Thank you for participating in that. Now, I didn't put this on the Slido, but I am curious what folks think about what people who work in the organization would say or respond to those questions. Would they rate or rank them in the same way that you do? And I would encourage you all to go back and ask some of these questions to the folks within your own organizations or your network and community and see what their responses might be to those questions. In a lot of the data that I've looked at, there's a disparate or different experience between what people in organizations who tend to be in leadership positions may perceive or think or feel about safety and workplace belonging versus what employees themselves will say in terms of their own safety and belonging. And particularly if they belong to any of those categories that we looked at when we're talking about the broad spectrum of diversity within our organization. So anchoring us ourselves in this conversation about diversity, equity, inclusion, and how is it a pillar or is it a pillar for workplace safety? There are many different pillars that we could think about that contribute to safety, but I believe that this particular one is really important to be cognizant of. It goes without saying that in our current political climate, the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion can be wildly misrepresented, right? And so we wanted to think about this idea from the space of the people that we work with every day and how we can best support all of our teammates or employees, depending on the organization that you're in. Um, it goes without saying that as we think about the history of our country, that there were many times, or continue to be times, where not everybody had equal access or equal opportunity in the workplace or in the community that they lived in. And so I wanted to put together just some supporting legislation, and this is not comprehensive by any regard, but some legislation that supports the idea of workplace safety or contributes to workplace safety. Now, in 1963, as most of you know, that the Equal Pay Act passed, and this was in support of ensuring that all folks, regardless of their gender identity, had access to equal pay. Why was that necessary? Because our workplaces tended to be predominantly male. And when a lot of women joined the workforce, there were huge discrepancies in pay, even if people were coming in with the same level of education, as well as having the same kind of experience. And it became necessary to pass something like the Equal Pay Act. The one that is most notable to most people is the Civil Rights Act. And the part of it that is important when it comes to workplace safety is the portion that prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, all of those things. That was necessary, obviously, through a lot of advocacy because discrimination is something that existed and folks could be offered job or declined jobs based on their identities. Of course, it covers beyond employment, it includes housing and other areas. But just to highlight that 1963 is not that long ago, right? 1964 is not that long ago. And from that time all the way to 2023, where you see the Crown Act, are there folks in here who know what the Crown Act is? Don't see anyone raising their hand. So I put this in here on purpose because it's the most recent legislation around hair. And I see Mayor Norton has raised her hand, so I'll let her respond to that. Mayor Norton, did you want to offer a response to the Crown Act?
Well, it had to do with, yeah, as you were pointing out, with hair, and I think had to do with African American, I don't know, in response to afros or where that came, but I do remember the legislation and the discussion about it back in the day. Not that long ago, actually, but.
Yep, not that long ago. So 2023, thank you for that. And I picked this one out on purpose. So the Crown Act, it's creating a respectful and open world for natural hair. A law that prohibits discrimination based on hair texture and protective hairstyles associated with race, such as afros, braids, twists, and locks, such as what I have in my hair right now. And I find it interesting that we have to, or had to have an act passed in order to have folks in the workplace or in communities not discriminated against based on hair. As we think about all of these, they're all in support of ensuring that we have communities, workplaces, etc., that are safe for people so that they don't face discrimination or harm in any way. Quite often, when I bring up, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act and ask, what year did that pass? People will often say, oh, that must have been in 1940 something or maybe 18 something. And it's always startling to folks when they realize that it wasn't until 1990 that the Americans with Disabilities Act passed to ensure that our workplaces and public spaces, our websites, and other places were accessible to our community members that have disabilities. So this supporting legislation is important, yes, because of the advocacy and the access it provides to community members with all of these broad identities. But in my mind, it is also very telling of the necessity to have safe workplaces and safe communities for folks, and the importance that diversity, equity, and inclusion work plays in that space. So I'm stuck here for a little bit. We go back to this idea of who our communities are. As we think about all of that legislation that has passed, and the idea that these are the folks who show up into our workspaces every day. And in reaction to a lot of that legislation and the recognition that our communities and our workplaces continue to diversify at a really rapid rate, many organizations have come up with different organizational DEI structures. How do they address some of these, the legislation or the experiences of community members in the workplace? Depending on your own organization, and you can put this in the chat as we're talking through it, some organizations have a standalone DEI department where there is a DEI coordinator or a DEI director or a racial equity coordinator. And these vary quite differently depending on the organization. Other organizations have a diversity, equity, and inclusion person embedded in the human resources department or their people operations. Some of you might have DEI councils or committees that are run within your own organizations, or maybe employee resource groups or affinity groups. I know we have those in the city of Rochester. Many times, if it's a smaller organization, they might have a consultant or an external partnership that comes in. But we also have organizations where equity is embedded across all functions across the organization. And all of these are, of course, to support that legislation, but also to support the employees that exist within those spaces. What I find fascinating in looking at all of the DI structures, reading through experiences of equity practitioners in all of these different models, is that diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners have one of the highest turnover rates across the nation. 2 years or less on average. And so when I saw this, I thought this could not possibly be correct. And I looked at a couple different sources to see if that was true, compared to other folks in leadership positions who, on average, would work for 5 years or less, even in high stress positions with a lot of work. And they attribute this to a couple of different things. One, there's a huge burnout factor. Many organizations might hire a DI practitioner in whichever role, embedded in whichever way, without the structures across the organizations to support that practitioner. And very quickly, that practitioner might get burned out. It might be also because of additional pressures in their own personal lives if they happen to be a person of a diverse identity. So they are navigating personal pressures of their own identity as well as systemic and organizational one. And very quickly, they burn out of that work, especially if they don't have support from their organization and their leadership within. So I bring this out on purpose for all of us to think about our own organizations and where we're coming from. Sometimes there's a lack of executive support. Things might get difficult and they're trying to balance the needs of the whole organizations versus the needs of communities that are diverse. And then obviously we reference recent job market trends. Where is their value? Where is it perceived as valuable to have an equity practitioner and where is it not? So thinking about your own organization, thinking about your DEI structure, how are you able to support the people who are doing this work? And is that work subscribed to one person or one department, or is it embedded across all functions of your organization because it would have a high impact on the success of any initiative or of that particular DEI practitioner? So why do we think about diversity, equity, inclusion being a pillar for workplace safety? Consolidated a couple of things here. There's the idea of psychological safety, that if you are in a workplace that has all of that legislation and initiatives embedded, that you feel able to express yourself. You're able to show up authentically. You feel safe at work. You feel valued. You know that you have equal access to promotions, etc. There's also increased retention. One of the articles I read said organizations that have affinity groups or ERGs have diverse teammates tend to stay 10 years longer than organizations where they do not have the ability to have those affinity groups. There's improved reporting and accountability. So asking yourselves within your own organizations, do you have structures that allow for people to provide reports or to have conflict resolution when they arise? We obviously want to work in places where there isn't harassment or discrimination. So a reduction in that if you have DEI embedded within your own organization. And for most of us, I'm looking through the list of folks on this call, our organizations are service delivery. We're delivering a service to the community, or maybe we're even selling a commodity to the community. With embedded equity work, there is increased innovation and, of course, increased service delivery to the communities that we're serving. And then lastly, legal compliance. I put that last on purpose. We always want to make sure that we're compliant legally. With this framework in mind, because I was just providing the backdrop, we're thinking about current climate. What do we do? We're in a position where we have organizations that serve the public. We are cognizant, based on the responses that you provided, that we would like to be welcoming. We want to provide places of belonging. We want to retain employees. We would love to continue the trend of our employees and teammates feeling safe at work, being able to be productive. What are some tangible steps that we can take in this space? What is available to us as a resource? And so with that backdrop, I will pass it on to my teammate, Wafa El Khalifa, to provide us an overview of maybe some tangible things that you're able to do within your own organizations to ensure that equity continues to be a pillar that provides safety in the workplace for the people who work there.
Thank you, Chow. I'll have you maneuver the slides for me since you're sharing the screen. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to encourage all of you to still utilize the chat and drop your comments and questions. We will read your questions and comments after I go through my portion of the presentation. As Chow and I, we were preparing the content for this month episode. We thought it's really important as we are in this political climate that how can we create resources for our community in order to support one another and to also continue what we committed to as a community. And so through some research and looking up information and checking with consultants, we were able to bucket some of these resources and some of these actions that your organizations can take into these six buckets that you see on the screen, which I'm going to go through each one of them individually, provide you some context for each one of them. And I would say that please don't hesitate to connect with me or Chow, as Chow and I were looking to create additional resources that we could provide to you or to your organization to help you with assisting your employees, providing them with support, or how can we also connect you to some consultants, some legal firms. We are working on preparing the episode also for March that hopefully it will provide some content in the legal way as well from a legal advisor. And so for today, we're just setting the foundation of how can your organization continue to support its employees. And I'll have you, Chow, go to the next slide. And so with the next slide, as you see here on the screen, it is important to understand the legal landscape and to review the legal implications. So if you are a service provider to the community, if your organization relies on some federal funding, if it relies on, specific programs, it is important to understand the legal implications. And this is the time that you should have conversations with your legal consultant or an organizational legal lawyer in order to understand what are the impacts on your program and how it will impact also your community and the people that you provide service to. And then, as Chow shared earlier, all these acts within the legislation, and it is important to align your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts with these legislation, with these acts that they were passed out for quite some time. And there is also conversations today in today's time about metrics and merit, and we gotta acknowledge the positive impact on that we have witnessed in this country because of these acts and legislation that they were passed. So when you think of the Civil Rights Act, for example, and it was led by the African Americans, but the impact on it impacted immigrants in many communities from all around the world that they were looking to move here to the US and to start a life. Before the Civil Rights Act, there were, laws like the Chinese exclusion, naming the discrimination towards a specific population and to be excluded from getting opportunities in work. And so because of the civil rights, we're able to see even the impact of that in our community as we are here in Rochester, and that we have the largest employer in the state of Minnesota, Mayo Clinic. Seeing the doctors that we have, seeing the medical staff that they work here, seeing the talent, the diverse talent that works here just within Mayo Clinic, All that because of the civil rights that removed the discrimination and opened opportunities for all these communities to be present here today, to be able to contribute to our economies with their talent, with their innovation, but also have access to job opportunities here and build a life. And then the next item that I want to share with you all, Chow, you can go to the next one. That's your cue, by the way. The next item, okay? So the next item is, as you look into your workplace and with the questions that Chow shared earlier, could maybe be the start of opening a dialogue and feedback within your work organization. It is important to have open dialogue and create channels for anonymous feedback for all your employees, because as you have witnessed in the results in the Slido that Chow was conducting a bit ago, there are some people who were saying, no, the workplace is not safe. So how can you create space for those, even if they're a minority within your organization, to be able to share their feedback openly, honestly, and without feeling that they're being targeted or being identified? So think about ways that you can create anonymous feedback channels. Also, the other item that I listed here under this bucket, which is really important, it is really important to frame diversity, equity, inclusion as people and a business strategy. This is the time not to frame diversity, equity, inclusion in a political way. This is the time to think about the communities that you're serving, because you're providing service to the community. So who lives in this community? Who are you providing them with your services, with your products? And are you able to reach to all of them? Are you able to communicate with all of them? And are they able to receive the information and the services equitably? And so when you think of diversity, equity, inclusion from a business strategy, that you are looking to expand your business and you're looking to expand your customer base, instead of thinking about it from a political standpoint. And from a people standpoint, you recognizing as an organization the talent that you have and what they bring to your company, your organization, and what they contribute in terms of innovations and new ideas. It is important to support and frame diversity, equity, inclusion as you're thinking about the staff and the people that you have part of your department, your organization, and so forth. And the last item that I've listed here is dialogue over debate. How can you have productive conversations within your workspace that is not a debate? It's a dialogue. It's a space where people can have conversations and can hear one another. It's not about who is going to win the situation. Can we find a common ground? Can we find a common benefit among all our differences? And I think it's really important to also equip your leadership with skills to facilitate respectful and productive discussions. How ready your leadership are in terms of conversations that you're having within your team, that they're able to manage these conversations and keep the space open for dialogue versus dismissing the conversation because they're not equipped, or this conversation can turn to be awkward. It is time for us to recognize what are our strengths, even as leaders, and what are our areas that we could work on improving and becoming better in order to be available to offer support for everyone within our organizations. The next bucket here that I have here, highlight personal responsibility. And often you see diversity, equity, and inclusion is tied to organizations' external commitment towards the community. And we have seen that for the past couple of years, organizations committing this much to the community. But what type of work the organization's leadership have done mentally to shift their mindset in order to understand the implications of decisions that they could be making today on some communities that they are not represented in their boards and in their decision making tables. And so this is the time where leaders and employees should be encouraged to spend time to educate themselves and to learn about the different communities that they serve, different cultural communication styles that they should adapt. It's time for them to learn and to spend time on self-education. I also want to encourage organizations to look into active allyship and how can you create support for whether they are the DI practitioners or they are the uh, marginalized employees that you have from the different communities, the different layers of diversity. How can you create allyship for your staff and how they can find their support? How can you position your organization to have allyship? And maybe one of the ways that we have done that, and we're trying to do that, and we're trying to encourage organizations to join the Equity Alliance. The Equity Alliance is a form of creating allyship. I think the partnership, the City of Rochester and Destination Medical Center, that we see it in public infrastructure and in supporting housing projects and in supporting sustainability efforts and initiatives, it is natural for the two organizations to form an allyship and to form this equity alliance in order to move forward together to achieve better outcomes, to create more equitable Rochester. And so find that organization for yourself, find that partner for yourself in order to find the support and find the allyship, because it is really needed. And I often say, like, I spend a lot of time with Chow, working with Chow personally, and we we find it very important. And this dynamic that we have here in our city, which is in comparison to other cities in Minnesota, and this partnership that we have is very unique. And also we have to protect it because that's what's making us successful and to continue doing our work. The next item that I have here is integrate DEI into core values and practices. And this is the time to reaffirm DEI in your core values, in your mission, vision, in your organization's values. How can you include inclusivity, fairness, and belonging in your mission statement, in your company values? And always think of the community that you're providing service to. Because in this community, we do have people with disabilities. We have a growing population, senior population or aging population. We do have veterans in our community. We do have people with different forms of mental health and or disability. We do have people from different religious backgrounds. Who are you providing service to? And are they included in your mission and company's value? Also in this item here, it is important to apply diversity, equity, inclusion to your performance and business outcomes. And this is where you're creating tracking and metrics in order to see the growth. How are you using your employee surveys to understand, is there improvement within my workplace for employees? If I have done a winter assessment in doing a summer assessment to understand these anonymous assessments and to see if there is improvement in the workplace. Are we conducting pay equity audits? Are we working towards goals where people are paid equitably? Are we working on having better representation into our boards, in our leadership? Are we tying DEI into business goals? And as we talked about and Chow talked about, also diversity drives innovation and improves decision making. And we have witnessed that in our community as we looked into ways to engage people from underserved, underrepresented communities. We were able to find solutions for and recommendations for how can we make Discovery Walk as a linear park better, and include different elements that a typical architecture firm or design firm did not think about. How, with community co-design and engaging with people that you normally don't see in your typical engagement ways, we were able to be awarded $1 million through the Bloomberg Philanthropies Mayor's Challenge Equity in the Built Environment. And the examples of when we do intentionally think about engaging everyone in the community, we can come with very innovative solutions and very awesome ideas that is removing issues that we've dealt with for the longest time. When we have a BIPOC home ownership co-design that comes up with recommendations that creates a mentorship program that one of our nonprofits takes the lead on here in Rochester to provide mentorship for our BIPOC communities in order to increase the home ownership rate. It's a disparity that we've lived with for the longest time here in Minnesota. But with that type of engagement, that intentionality, we're able to come with innovation and awesome solutions. The next item that I have here is foster mentorship and career development. As you're looking into your workplace as a leader, or as you are working with your staff, with your colleagues, and understand the different layers and the different representations each of your staff holds. And as we're in this political climate, it is really important to think about pairing your diverse talent with leaders and also create opportunities for reverse mentorship. Who is working in teams? Who is working on initiatives? Who is working on programs and projects that you have within your organization? Creating, by being very intentional, creating opportunities for senior leaders to learn from junior leaders with different backgrounds and different perspectives, connect the underrepresented employees with senior mentors for career guidance and networking, creating opportunities for people to actually connect with each other and to learn from each other. Because one of your employees could hold different lived experiences on something versus the other. And this is the opportunity for your employees to learn from each other, to create that empathy and understanding. Also, it's also a way to foster new relationships within your organization, and allyship and understanding. Offer tailored career development programs. So this is the time to assess your employees and their performance, and also to see how you can help them as an organization to grow, to see themselves that they're being invested in within your organization, that they are beyond the diversity hire, or they're beyond the representation to show that your organization has diverse representation, that they are part of your organization, that you are investing in them, and that you're intentionally having them on your team because you do appreciate their innovation and what they bring to the table. And this is also connects to integrating DEI into performance and promotions. The next item is, or the last item, which is invest in mental health and well-being. And this is the time where organizations and leaders can look into their teams and their staff and ensuring that there is equitable access to mental health resources. When we talk about mental health and how some organizations has resources allocated for mental health, but are these resources equitable? Are these resources um, in the mental health are culturally appropriate for the different employees that you have? You maybe have employees with linguistic barriers. Are these resources available for them in the languages that they are proficient in versus English? This is time to assess the resources that you offer to your employees and the benefits as an organization that you provide, and see if it's equitable for everyone in your staff. And in this bucket here, I did list that it is important to recognize the signs of burnout and to understand there are physical signs, there are emotional, behavioral signs, and it is important to address burnout and to create opportunities for open conversations to promote work-life balance. Also, as you are in the organization, are you developing stress reduction initiatives? Are you spending time to build relationships with each other within your team? Are you spending time on a team lunch, for example, or something that would remove the stress on some of your team members? Because some team members maybe not impacted with the changes in the political environment, but some team members are, and some team members may feel targeted, may feel unwelcomed in the time and the space that we're in right now. And so it is important to recognize these signs of burnout, and that's how you create a safe work environment for yourself and for your team members. And with that, I believe it ends my presentation.
Thank you, Wafa. And I really appreciate kind of the broad ideas and thoughtful kind of presentations about things that we can take back to our organizations. I do see there were lots of wonderful comments in the chat, but there was a question here from Tawanda. It says a lot of organizations are moving away from annual performance reviews. That said, what could organizations do to continue to promote DEI with intent without these annual reviews? So, Tawanda, I want to make sure that I'm understanding your question correctly. So you're saying if there isn't an annual review, what are other ways that organizations could continue to promote equity?
Yes, that's correct. Like I said, I kind of heard that, like I said, a lot of organizations are not doing annual reviews anymore, just because it's a different assessment, evaluation tool, right? That could prevent growth as well at the same time. So if organizations are moving away from that annual performance review, what can they do in the interim, throughout the year to continue to promote DEI with intent?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I want to thank Wafa too. But I think one of the things that can be done even outside of a review process would be stay interviews. Some organizations do that. along with exit interviews, although, of course, Tawanda, we don't want to wait until an exit interview. But the idea of having stay interviews, whether that is a quarterly thing that you're doing with folks in your organization to say, why do you continue to work here? What are the things that are going well? What would we need to do differently for you to continue to be here? How are you experiencing this organizational culture, etc.? On a much smaller scale outside of stay interviews, I know that some organizations have a weekly or monthly check-in with the people that you're supervising. So whatever works within your organizational framework, but I think to have it be intentional and have it be something that is continuous, so that there's that expectation and knowledge from the people that you're working with that they're going to have an opportunity to have that conversation. Other thoughts, Wafa, to that question?
No, yeah, I totally agree with you. I immediately thought of stay interviews, creating that anonymous also feedback opportunity. But I think there's some organizations, yes, maybe they're removing the annual review. But you as an employee, what type of relationship do you have with the person you're reporting to? Um, I remember I asked for, oh, as I'm being hired, I would like to have an assessment after 90 days after I got hired. And of course, it depends on where you're working. But this is something where we could definitely ask one of our consultants and see if it's worth having like a topic, a full dive into from an HR perspective. We can definitely do that too.
Mhm. Yeah, and for the rest of the folks, please feel free to utilize the chat or just come off of mute if you have a reflection or a question. Doesn't have to be a question, it can just be a reflection. And I see, Amanda, that you're unmuted.
Yes, I was going to raise my hand. So one form of just kind of employee check-in I've heard of before is something called a pulse survey. And so it speaks a little bit to like having an anonymous platform to share feedback, and it's normally very short. So that's the idea. It's something you're sending consistently, but it's like 2 to 3 questions at most, similar to kind of what our activity was at the beginning of this session. And it just helps you kind of keep a pulse on employee satisfaction, feelings about belonging, feelings about workplace safety. So it's a pretty simple thing to do, and it can yield some benefit there. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Amanda. There's some comments. I see a comment from Al. Diversity is especially important for larger organizations that does business globally. Absolutely. Also to the DEI doubters and who proclaim merit-based workforce, we must make a case that DEI in fact aligns with competitive workforce development and talent recruitment, so it reaches a larger skill source. Yeah, go ahead, Al.
This is more just from my own background in the technology space, right? The Silicon Valley sentimentality about diversity inclusion. Right now, as we all know, the Silicon Valley tech groups are really pushing back on DEI, even though one time they embraced it, when 6-8 years ago. So their complaint, for particular Google, for example, what they found out, in fact, you can hear them from the podcasting and all, is that when they have this opinion survey and all that, they're finding out the employees are making too much demand on them. They claim now, this is the management claim, right? That the employee are becoming too empowered, too obnoxious, whatever, to the detriment of workforce productivity, and that is their complaint. That's the management view. So I guess I don't know how prevalent this sentiment is in Rochester, but that is really the sentiment of companies like Walmart. You can sort of hear that they're coming. That's a justification of sort of diluting their DEI effort. McDonald's and all these, companies. So we need to, in our own conversation, we need to sort of be mindful, develop some kind of strategy that's give it the counterpoint about we are really embracing long-term workforce development and managing in a way that uh, allows for conversation that is trusted, that is, even though maybe difficult, is still being conducted in a respectful manner, that type of thing. That's sort of I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but it's really the concern I've always had is that we're not mindful of the strategy we pursued. We'll just give the other side a more weapon to divide us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Al. And Wally, I saw your two comments in the chat and I see your hand up, so we go ahead.
Yeah,
Welcome.
just it's more um not directly in response to what Al just shared. Number one, I don't think it's because people are placing too many demands or uh I do think this though, because we all know we want to get to a better place, and there's an important role that community plays there. Not having these conversations will essentially make sure that, the disparities persist. I know because of, prior to coming to the United States, lived in a country that did that. And throughout history shows that's the case. So there should be nothing new. So, but the question is, how do we engage people in these conversations? Because by not engaging in the conversation, things are going to get worse. So if you think that this is just going to be where it ends, that's not going to be the case. So just want to throw that out there. I do know that in terms of like when Wildfire, I believe you mentioned, like mental health and support. Yes, from an NAACP, there are initiatives that we're going to be focusing on that's on, resiliency, trauma support for community members. But there was even like but there is also a role that people can play in organizations. So for example, there was a Gallup study that talked about that when people have emotional support, social support from best friends at work, they actually stay longer. And so we all need to find out I'd say we want to find people supports in our workplaces. Maybe they're not best friends, but that's something that you want to strive for, because that makes a direct correlation in terms of, okay, well, can I continue to work here, or do I have the strength to move forward? So again, so that's what I would encourage us to do. And then but then also from a community perspective, a lot of this is going to be community based. When you look at the civil rights movement or this desegregation of schools or the military, this did not happen by themselves. Good people had to come together to say no. And so that's the challenge that we'll have to collectively work towards.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Wale, and thank you for your comments. And hopefully everyone saw some of the comments that you had about the activities that the NAACP has for Black. Please follow their page. Also, Amanda does send out, Amanda Pelly from Rochester Foundation provides us with a list of all the activities and events and that they're happening. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I want to thank you all for tuning in today. We will be seeing you next March 12. We will have a presenter in March that will provide us with some information from the legal standpoint. So we're super excited about the March episode. And I am also interested to know from all of you, feel free to email me and email Chow if you all are interested in an unrecorded session that can be done virtually, just so we don't end up having to get people to come and create a barrier. We could do a session virtually, unrecorded, invitation only to have breakout sessions, to have discussions. If people are interested in that, we're more than happy to do something like that, to hold that space for you all. We've received some comments regarding that, and so we're sticking with the consistent way that we have done the equity series, that we have it virtually. It's recorded and goes to YouTube. But if you all are interested in unrecorded session specific to, certain people, more than happy to do that. I want to thank you all for being here with us. Thank you so much. Thank you for the awesome questions, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.